morning again. Friends, this morning we continue our Black History Month worship series focused on clarifying call. This morning we look at the beautifully poignant story of a woman who weeps onto Jesus' feet. She uses her hair to wipe up those tears, and then she anoints those feet with expensive perfume. What's her name? Nobody knows. So, for today at least, let's make one up. Let's call her Miss Yvonne. Miss Yvonne was a kind, quiet woman. She tended to the needs of the people around her so efficiently and so humbly that sometimes you wouldn't even notice. You'd be in her house and suddenly, like magic, a glass of ice water would appear on the coffee table before you. You'd be at church after a potluck, dreading the work of washing dishes and clearing tables, but before you could even start begging for volunteers, there would be Miss Yvonne, already quietly at work. She was what I like to call a gap filler. She was one of those people who rarely criticized or complained about why something hadn't been done or wasn't being done. She just asked if she could help and then started helping, started filling in the gap. Over the years, however, Miss Yvonne apparently had earned an unfavorable reputation. She became known in her small town as a loose woman, somebody who entertained men in ways that weren't entirely suitable, to put it mildly. Despite her being kind and being helpful, despite her willingness to regularly do the work that everybody else either despised or forgot about, Miss Yvonne lived in a shadow of shame. One day, Luke chapter 7, verse 36 reads, "One of the Pharisees asked Jesus over for a meal. He went to the Pharisee's house and sat down at the dinner table. Just then, Miss Yvonne, a woman of the village, the town harlot, having learned that Jesus was a guest in the home of the Pharisee, she came with a bottle of very expensive perfume and stood at his feet, weeping, raining tears on his feet. Letting down her hair, she dried his feet, kissed them, and anointed them with the perfume. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, 'If this man was the prophet I thought he was, he would have known what kind of woman this is who is falling all over him.'" In other words, if Jesus had known that Miss Yvonne was the town harlot, the Pharisee thinks out loud, surely he would have shunned her just like I have, just like any righteous person would. True to form, though, Jesus doesn't fixate on Miss Yvonne's so-called sins, but rather focuses on her enduring behavior. In verse 45, Jesus responds to the Pharisee, "Do you see this woman? I came to your home. You provided no water for my feet, but she rained down tears on my feet and dried them with her hair. You gave me no greeting, but from the time I arrived, she hasn't quit kissing my feet. You provided nothing for freshening up, but she has soothed my feet with perfume." In other words, still, you want to call out her horrible sins, but why don't you pay attention to her hospitality? Hospitality you didn't even extend in your own home. You want to complain, but here she is filling in gaps. You want to criticize, meanwhile she's doing the work you forgot all about. You can call her names, but she's living out the call to care. It's clear who the more righteous one is in this story. When it comes to living out the Christian call, it's clear, in this moment anyway, that Jesus prefers the gap filler, the quiet caregiver, over the so-called expert Pharisee who criticizes. Even so, while we do get the expert's name, Simon, we're left to wonder, or plain old make up the so-called harlot's name. It's what so often happens with the gap fillers, though, isn't it? In a family, it's so often the ones who are doing the most critical work that so rarely receive a show of gratitude. The mother who makes sure everybody has clean sheets is hardly, if ever, thanked for doing so. The father who gets the groceries and makes the meals in between work calls is hardly recognized for filling in that gap. The elder sibling who takes care of the younger one might not even get acknowledged as the unpaid babysitter. The gap filler who makes it possible for the parents to stay later at work or go on their date. Now, in addition to families, churches are notorious for overlooking the gap fillers. As time and time again, folks seem to assume that those coffee cups on the counter just wash themselves. Thank you for doing that, Alice and Susanna and others. Time and time again, folk just seem to assume that those paper plates you left on the table just magically get composted. Thank you, Bryant and others. Time and time again, folks just think that those broken handrails over by the stairs just miraculously get repaired. Thank you, Larry. And of course, all this happens. The gap fillers go unthanked so often because they so rarely ask for thanks. The Miss Yvonnes of the world are doing the work that everybody else forgets, hates, or overlooks, not because they want adulation. They do that work because they're kind and helpful people, because they're busybodies who need something to do, because they want to support the folks they care about. And so they actually sometimes don't even want to be thanked. Sorry, Susanna, Alice, Bryant, and Larry, if I embarrassed you. And so we sometimes forget to even notice the work they do, let alone thank them for it. Folks like Miss Yvonne, the gap fillers of the world, don't fuss or spend time complaining, really. More often, they just see a problem and pick up the work. They aren't looking for gratitude. They aren't calling for recognition. All they need is a green light to go out and fix the things that need fixing. What if, though, what needs to be fixed is a lack of recognition? Marsha P. Johnson was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1945. Known to her family members as Mikey, she knew from a young age that she was different. As a 5-year-old boy, she would wear dresses and walk around her neighborhood feeling free and beautiful. But she learned quickly that other people didn't appreciate the sight of a little black boy wearing girls' clothing. As she reached her teenage years, she continued to feel different, and she knew it was time to leave home. At the age of 17, she joined the Navy. Using her birth name, Malcolm Michaels Jr., she stayed long enough to earn her GED and some useful skills, and then she was honorably discharged about a year later. Rather than return home, though, she set out for New York City and eventually came out as gay and as she. During her time in New York, she became known as the mayor of Christopher Street. Christopher Street, a strip of bars, apartments, and businesses that acted as a center of LGBTQ life in New York. She rubbed shoulders with the likes of pop artist Andy Warhol. She joined or founded a number of LGBTQ rights organizations. And when the police showed up at the Stonewall Inn, one late night in June of 1969, Marsha P. Johnson was among the first to stand up, to shout out, and to fill in the gap. She stepped up and spoke up as the police harassed her chosen family, as they rained down fire and violence that night, as they threatened to destroy a gathering place her community loved. Marsha P. Johnson was a gap filler. Though she wasn't known for being quiet, though she wasn't known for being invisible, There are forces at work, friends, that are trying to absent her from American history. For almost 10 years now, Stonewall has been celebrated as a national monument, part of the federally governed National Park Service. The website for the Stonewall Monument, as of a few weeks ago, however, now reads this way. Before the 1960s, almost everything about living openly as a lesbian, gay, bisexual, LGB person was illegal. The Stonewall Uprising on June 28, 1969 is a milestone in the quest for LGB civil rights and provided momentum for a movement. LGB. There seems to be a gap in those letters, doesn't there? We are living in a time, friends, in which people who have been leading protests and making change, people who have packed our groceries or harvested our food, people who have served as our society's gap fillers, these people are at risk of being disappeared. Whether by changing history or by redefining gender or by indiscriminately deporting people, we are living in a time in which folks are getting pushed into the shadows. We are living in a time in which certain people's names are at risk of being totally forgotten, a time in which some powerful people are concertedly working not to fill gaps, but to create them. At a time like ours, then, we can't only complain or criticize, even if what we are saying is right. At a time like ours, we, all of us, are called to fill in the absences within our shared stories and within our shared memory. We are called to notice who's missing from our history and from our lives so that the people who have so often been overlooked aren't disappeared forever. At a time like ours, friends, we are called to be gap fillers. And like all good gap fillers, we might actually do our work quietly. We may live into this call subtly without needing recognition ourselves. We may be no bolder than any other gap filler, quietly fixing things that need fixing. We may, without fanfare or self-congratulation, tell our friends about people like Marsha P. Johnson. We may nonchalantly choose to do a school report about her for our history class. We may make her biography a part of our book clubs at a time that isn't Pride Month. We may simply tell her story and point out how we, in one way or another, are standing on her shoulders, regardless of our sexual or gender identity, because we get to be in a place that is that much more inclusive and compassionate because of the gaps she helped fill in. And maybe we might take this work a step deeper, quietly, subtly, thanklessly learning the names of the other gap fillers in our lives too. Maybe we learn the names of the folks who are most likely to be forgotten, the people whose names the historians will most likely set aside, the people who more often get talked about rather than talked to. In other words, perhaps our call at a time like this is to be the people who constantly, yet maybe still quietly, ask ourselves and each other, who's missing from the story? Who's missing from the room? Who's missing from the conversation when the decisions get made? Why isn't, we might ask, Ukraine part of the negotiations about Ukraine? Why aren't Palestinians coming to the Oval Office to discuss Gaza? To take it to the personal, maybe, we might ask ourselves, how could my elderly parent be part of the conversation regarding their own care? How my kid be part of the conversation regarding their schedule of extracurricular activities? How might our guests be more a part of our planning down in the food justice ministry? We can ask these questions not as a virtue signal, not as a passive-aggressive complaint. We can ask them in a spirit of compassion, of inquiry, out of our quiet effort to fill in gaps. Part of our call to recognize and remember all the people who are at risk right now of disappearing, all the people whose names might get forgotten. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying you need to go out from here and befriend every brown person you can find. I'm not saying you need to go buddy up with the next trans or gender non-conforming person you think you see. However, I suspect that you may already have a relationship with somebody you depend on. Somebody who bags your groceries or carries your mail or cleans your apartment building or mows your lawn or fought for your rights. Somebody who fundamentally affects your life and you may not know their name or at least anything about their story beyond what they do or have done for you. I don't blame you. Not really. It's how our society is designed. So often, the people who fill the gaps, who do the work that nobody else thinks to or wants to, are meant to be invisible, unknown, and nameless. They are meant to be replaceable, exchangeable, forgettable. As important to you as the machines who may one day do their jobs. They are meant to be expendable, erasable, killable, willing to risk their lives for our freedoms, standing on the front lines of the movements and the battles and the meatpacking lines and the tomato plantations, only to be disappeared when somebody decides it suits them. All the more reason, then, friends, for this call of ours. In times like these, as in many times past, we need to remember this. It's a lot harder to make someone disappear when somebody else knows their name. It's a lot harder for a gap to persist when somebody else is willing to notice what or who is missing. It's a lot more difficult to render people invisible when other folks are willing to look and to see out of love. Marsha P. Johnson was her name. And many folks believe she identified as what we now call gender nonconforming, trans, or queer. She had dreams and friends and fears, and she was courageous, and she helped in her own way to build this country. Let us remember her name, friends. So at some point, in some distant future, we won't need to make one up. May it be so, and amen. We now worship God as we present our offerings.